Well, good evening. We are so glad you could join us tonight for the third MFI Virtual Book Club. Over the past month, we've been reading Carl Trueman's Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. This is actually a condensed version of Trueman's much longer and heavier, detailed book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Both works lay out how we arrived at our current hyperemphasis on the self, self-expression, self-fulfillment, and even self-defined realities or personal truths. Now, it's no coincidence that the foreword for the earlier longer book was written by Rod Dreher, MFI's first book club guest and author of Live Not by Lies. Now, the foreword to tonight's book was written by last year's book club author, Ryan T. Anderson. His book about the transgender moment, titled When Harry Became Sally, was banned by Amazon. All three authors see what we are experiencing today and understand that it is driven by lies, built on a foundation of ignoring or outright denying objective truths. But how did we get here? Where the statement, "I'm a man trapped in a woman's body," makes sense to a vast segment of our population. That's one of the questions tonight's book tackles. To summarize, our society has experienced an intellectual revolution predicated on fundamental changes on how the self was understood. The self must be psychologized, psychology must be sexualized, and sex must be politicized. Now, having spent the last decade engaged full-time at the intersection of sex and politics, I have to admit, I still learned a lot from this book. I was familiar with the names of the thinkers discussed in it, like Rousseau, Nietzsche, Freud, Reich, etc. But I had not realized how much animus they had toward Christianity. And most shockingly to me, and relevant to our current crisis, how sexually depraved many of them were, not only in their writings, but if you look up their biographies, in their personal lives as well. In fact, one could be forgiven for coming to the conclusion that we really are being manipulated by a conspiracy of God-hating pedophiles and groomers operating in plain sight. And this book can point you to the receipts to prove it, with the caveat that this conspiracy started over a century ago, and many of its goals are only now fully metastasizing, with the underlying principles having become broadly incorporated into what Trueman calls the social imaginary, or how we intuitively relate to the world, like a gut-level worldview, perhaps. For example, Trueman describes Freud in his essay, Civilization and Its Discontents, not only placing sexual gratification at the center of adult human identity, but Freud also extends sexuality back to infancy. And if children are sexual from birth, then to be human is always to be sexual, even prior to the onset of puberty. One might say that it is part of the very essence of humanity to be a sexual being. One might go as far as to say that sexuality is the primary and most important part of being human. Now, this is much of what underlies the current debates we're having about sex education in schools, parental rights versus a child's right to transition from one gender to another, or, as is pending in the Massachusetts legislature right now, a bill that would allow girls of any age to get an abortion with no parental consent or judicial bypass needed. It also is the conceptual backdrop for why in that same legislation, the awkward and intentionally vague term pregnant person is used, rather than the obvious and necessarily more accurate pregnant girl or pregnant woman. Since we have come to the place where, as Freud suggested, our sexual desires and self-expression actually constitute who we are at a fundamental level, then biological women can be men, and those men can become a pregnant person. Honestly, it still makes my head spin a bit. But it's proof positive that ideas do indeed have consequences, and we are reaping the whirlwind sown by these intellectual elites decades ago. Fortunately, Dr. Trueman will be joining us in a few minutes to help walk us through these ideas and hopefully give us some encouragement for how to respond. With me again tonight is a fellow pro-family advocate, founder of Refresh Ministry, which you can learn more about at refreshministry.com, and most importantly, a mom of 6 girls, Alana Stubblebine.
Yes, Andrew, thank you so much. So in addition to having 6 daughters in between the ages of 11 and 22, who are in the thick of this culture war, I also run a ministry for people who seek truth. So in order to respond to our times, I must first understand our times, and that is why I loved reading this book. Although the title, The Strange New World, is getting even stranger by the day. In fact, just last week, my daughter informed me that there was a group of teens from our town that were gathering for something called a furry gathering. And I didn't think you'd believe me, so I brought some pictures to show you. But they are these kids who gather in costumes, animal costumes, but they're hybrid animal costumes. So maybe a goat's head and a bunny tail, and they get together for lewd sexual acts. It is just so sad. And I didn't believe it until I looked on Instagram and started pulling up some of the furry parties. You won't read about this on the news probably, but you have to go on their Instagram and then you're going to learn a whole bunch of information you really don't want to know. But it certainly is. It's getting stranger by the day.
It is. And I have heard about furries, and, man, this got crazy fast while we're talking about this stuff. But really, that's just the logical extension of where these philosophers have taken us, that you can sort of define your own reality, particularly when it is tied to sexual desires, because that is such a core element of who you are as an individual being. So this is in many ways a logical conclusion of that.
It's so sad, this world that our kids are growing up in, something none of us can even wrap our heads around. So it's important for us to understand it. I love the foreword in this book by Ryan Anderson. He said that if you read it carefully, there's sparkles on every page. And I did agree with him, but I have to say, I had to read so slowly to really grasp all of the information. But I do appreciate Carl Trueman attempting to break this down to the average thinker. I do have some questions for him. I'm going to try to get it down a little further, maybe a 5th grade level. We'll see how we do.
Yeah, I guess sparkles isn't the word that I would use. I mean, I know what Ryan was saying, but I, again, was really just sort of shocked at some of the things that these influential intellectuals and writers were saying, particularly when it comes to children. And to kind of bring this close to home, we've been working for a while at Mass Family Institute on a case out of Ludlow, Massachusetts, where you had parents whose young children were being socially transitioned at school. There's a lawsuit to try and protect the parents' rights, and you had a federal judge basically say that's fine because transgenderism is involved. The student's identity, their sexual expression, gender expression, basically trumps everything else. Not only reality, but also the rights of the parents and the integrity of the family. More recently, there's a report out from the Attorney General's office here in Massachusetts, which is encouraging young people to make use of a whole number of organizations and clinics, nonprofit organizations, in order to fully express their sexuality. And when you read through it, when you read the descriptions of these organizations and what they do, again, some of them talk about how to get medical treatment or psychological treatment for any of the LGBTQ issues without parental consent. They also talk about, when they say youth, they mean children as young as 3 years old. And it confirms, I know there's been some back and forth about this on social media for the past 6 months or so, but that Boston Children's Hospital, their gender clinic there, does engage in transgender surgeries, specifically cosmetic elective double mastectomies on children as young as 15, on minors.
It's so terrible. And I read this week too that a new a teacher training went out, and they told the teachers that if they gender the kids, that they are going to be held accountable for their death if they commit suicide. Mm-hmm. And so these teachers are just being forced to do this. I mean, it's just terrible.
Right. That strategy has been very effective. It was used in the legislature. And parents are actually told, let's say if you've got parents who have a young daughter who identifies as male, they tell the parents you can have a live son or a dead daughter. But those are effectively the options, right? That they have to sort of embrace this cross-sex identity of their daughter and think of her as a son, or she's most likely going to kill herself.
It's terrible.
In most of the incidents that I've seen and dealt with legally and otherwise, there's almost always underlying mental health issues, that sort of exacerbate everything, and out of which the gender confusion typically comes. But that is what's addressed and affirmed, and it's supposed to be a panacea for everything else.
Yeah. And in terms of the Christians that may be working in the school districts, I mean, truth leads to life. Not death, always.
Right. Well, and that's one of the things I'm looking forward to talking with Dr. Trueman about this, that he mentions sort of at the end of his book as potentially the way forward, is he cites back to the early church and how Christians in the 2nd century, 3rd century, especially, were very bold about what they believed as Christians and made sort of positive arguments that Christians make the best citizens, the best employees, the best fathers, husbands, wives, mothers, because of their Christian virtue, because of what they believed and how that shaped their actions. And I think that's definitely a model we should follow. So often I feel like we are on the defensive, we're apologizing for the fact that what we believe might be offensive to people, and really we should be quite clear and confident in what we believe and what the implications of that are. The other side certainly is.
Right. We have the answers for human flourishing.
That's right.
Not
That's
them.
right. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, if I can find where it's quoted here, and again, we'll ask Dr. Trueman when he comes on. MFI is engaged in sort of Christian activism, is one way of mentioning that. He says on page 101, for those of you following along at home, as with the collapse of the authority of the church, nation, and family, this creates a vacuum of moral authority that is filled with the competing voices of a myriad of new identities and no objective way of adjudicating between them. And that means that society's moral order defaults to pragmatism and, put crudely, to the matter of who shouts the loudest and has the most effective lobby groups. And I think that's true. Unfortunately, that's the reality we're dealing with.
I love too, many times in this book, he says, it's not unforeseen that in a few years you may be seeing this or that. And I feel like just as I would read that, I would see the headlines on the news actually happening, the things that he predicted. So that was just really interesting. Right.
And we're definitely on the front lines of things here. And I think, sometimes I would argue it is a Christian duty to be someone who is shouting the loudest if we're shouting in defense of our children. I think we see that in school committee meetings where parents who are fed up and disgusted with what they're seeing finally show up to the meeting, and in some cases have to shout just in order to be heard because the petty bureaucrats are trying to cut them off or kick them out. But sometimes you have no other choice.
I love how he reverse engineered all of these things, really traced it back to the original law where things got passed. And even that law that got passed in Canada, he mentioned the same-sex marriage in the book, 2007, and how it transferred to 2012 here in Massachusetts. A law got overturned. He mentioned that in the book. So he really helped you to understand the genesis of how these things come out. It's years prior. You have to go back.
And I was surprised at how far back some of this stuff goes, and the fact that, again, what some of these authors are writing, whether it's Freud or Nietzsche, probably they wouldn't get published today if people knew what they meant, because there's such a heightened awareness of sort of pedophilia and the harm to children. But speaking of authors, we have a much better author to speak with. Dr. Carl Trueman is with us. Can you hear me, Dr. Trueman? Well, as he's sort of getting his camera and microphone lined up, we see him logged in, so that's good. There he is. Dr. Trueman, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Very good.
Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. We can hear you. We can't see you yet, though.
Okay. Telling me that you're not allowing me to switch my video on.
All right. Well, we've got...
Stop that.
All right. We'll get that rectified quickly. I know Mary Ellen's working on that to get your video working.
Okay.
But I guess we'll start with just audio while she's working on that. Again, thank you so much for joining us. This has really been a very helpful book. It's still, even in the what my dad was a philosophy major, so he read your full book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He calls this the Reader's Digest version. But for me, it was still a lot of names and concepts to try and keep track of, but was very helpful. I think I'd like to talk to you, if we kind of just jump right in, and we'll be taking some questions from the audience as well. I'd love to hear what your suggestions are, kind of from your last chapter. What are we to do now? I mean, living in Massachusetts, most people I talk to, we're aware of how bad things have gotten. It's helpful to know kind of how we got here, but what are we to do now? And you talk about the early church as setting a model for Christians today. Kind of talk us through that, if you would, a little bit.
Yeah, in some ways, I can't offer any short-term hope on the grounds that there's no single cause for the problems we currently face, and so there's no single or easy answer to them. So the first thing I think we have to grasp is the scale of the problem, and to realize that we're not going to solve it by this time next week. Now, some people might say, well, that's a very defeatist attitude. I actually think it's the opposite of defeatism. I think once you have a realistic understanding of the situation, and once you have a realistic understanding of what you are able to do about it, it lifts a huge burden off you. And there's a sense in which, first thing I'd want to say to people is, realize that the work you're doing today is perhaps work for which you will not see the fruit, but that does not mean it isn't worth doing. One of the examples I use in class for students is Cologne Cathedral. They start building Cologne Cathedral in 1248. Doesn't get finished until around about 1880. Over 600 years to build a cathedral. Now, the Reformation delays the building a little bit, but one thing we know is that nobody on the first day of building Cologne Cathedral ever assumed that they, or ever thought that they would live. Oh, there I am. I've appeared. You can see you haven't
Good to see you.
You haven't missing
Oh, there
not
he
been
is.
missing very much. I have a great face of a rodeo, I think the statement is. But they didn't think they'd ever worship in Cologne Cathedral, the men, the women who started the work, but they still thought it was worth doing. And I think one of the things we need to do is realize work we're doing today, we may not see the fruit of it, but that does not mean it isn't worth doing. We are laying foundations upon which subsequent generations can build. So that's the first thing I'd want to say. Second thing, the people we can have most influence on are the people we really know. You can blog, you can tweet, I write articles for First Things, Touchstone, etc., etc. I can do these things, but the people I really influence are the students in my classroom and the people in my church. So I think we need to focus our energies on training, mentoring, shaping the minds and the characters of the people that we actually come across on a day-to-day basis. Thirdly, I think one of the opportunities that the current mess gives us is if Christians are being marginalized, for example, well, marginality historically has proved to be a great opportunity for building strong communities. You think about the Jews in the Middle Ages. Think about the Quakers, the Baptists in England in the 19th century. Those who are pushed to the outskirts of society often find they make strong communities. Immigrants would be another example. My wife and I were reflecting recently on how close we are to our kids, and it suddenly dawned on us, well, we're immigrants. The only people we really feel we can rely on, if you like, is our own blood, our own kin at this point. So I think the marginalization that we're facing, we can lament that, but we can also think about how that might be an opportunity to build a strong community. Because one of the things I think we're going to see in the coming years is a collapse in true community in the wider world around us, and building a strong community can actually make the church attractive to those who are looking for places where they can belong, where they can be loved, where they can be truly cared for. And then, of course, as a Christian, I also want to say, remember the promises. And the promise is to the church. We know who's going to win. The church is going to win. It may not be my congregation, my denomination. It may not be America. But we know that at the end of time that the church is going to win, which really, again, lifts the pressure off us and means that what we have to do is we have to be faithful. We have to respond in Christian love towards the situations and circumstances in which we find ourselves. And we have to trust God for the increase.
Well, thanks, Carl. It's interesting to hear you talk about the immigrant community and how sort of being marginalized or being immigrants can grow a stronger, closer community. I've often thought that we as Christians in our current context can learn a lot from immigrant communities and the way that they have strong networks and that they support each other. I mean, as the laws kind of close in on us and it becomes less and less feasible for Christians to work for non-Christian corporations. That's going to be, I think, an important model for us to perhaps emulate with one major caveat, and that is, in America, one of our great strengths has been that immigrant communities come to America and assimilate into the broader culture. But that's exactly what we don't want to happen as Christians right now, given where our culture is. And that's what we see happening. I see happening a lot with Christian communities, instead of being stronger and being something set apart from the broader community that can then draw others to them, are assimilating into the broader culture. So what type of practical markers or distinctives, particularly in terms of the sexual chaos that we're seeing, should Christians have? And can we draw on the lessons from the early church for that as well?
Well,
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in there too. For you mentioned in your last chapter, I thought it was brilliant, as your solution is to kind of go back and teach the whole counsel of God in how it relates to the human body and the natural law. And I can remember a time when the Catholic Church used to teach that you should have lots of kids and not use birth control and all of these common sense things, but they weren't afraid to address natural bodily things in the church. And I just don't know anybody who is addressing that today. Simple, basic concepts like get married young, have children, lots.
Yeah. Yes, and I think you're pointing to a number of what I would call sort of pathologies of the modern age that are problematic for us. To take the first question, I think we face an interesting situation now where the way I would put this is, for many generations, the terms of membership in society have been not distinctively Christian, but compatible with being a Christian. Respect for property, etc., respect for human life. Freedom of speech, all of these things have been things that Christians have been able to affirm and therefore have found it easy to be members of a society that affirms those. What we face now, of course, is a society where the terms of membership are increasingly terms to which Christians cannot subscribe, particularly when it comes to matters of sex and gender and sexuality. That these are becoming litmus tests for what it means to be a decent member of the community. And those tests are automatically excluding or marginalizing any Christian who might hold to the traditional church's teaching on these things. And that's why I think the second century, and to an extent the third and early fourth centuries, are interesting for Christianity, because there, again, the terms of belonging to Rome, every now and then, you had to sacrifice to the emperor, or something came along that made it very, very difficult to both be a loyal member of the church and a loyal member of the Roman Empire. Early Christians strove to be loyal members of both, but there were moments and occasions when it was impossible to serve both Christ and be loyal to Caesar at the same time. And that's what interests me about the early church, because A, that led to persecution, and B, it did lead to these strong communities, because to resist tyranny in that way, you have to be a strong community. It's very hard to convince yourself that you're in the right if everybody else says you're in the wrong. Yeah, it's important to be surrounded by people who can offer mutual support as we face the kind of heat that's coming against us. To the second issue, the question of the whole counsel of God, particularly teaching on the body, I think Catholicism is way ahead of us, or way ahead of Protestants. I don't know what your own religious commitments are. I'm really talking about my own Protestant community here. I think Catholicism has a much richer understanding of the significance of the human body and of the importance of the human body, which gives it, at least in its conservative orthodox form, better resources for addressing some of the challenges. I had the privilege the other day of interviewing Abigail Favale, professor at Notre Dame, who's a Catholic and has studied gender theory at the highest level and come to repudiate it. And I started the interview by asking her, okay, Abigail, I'm going to ask you a question that seems to be perplexing some of the sharpest minds in our culture at the moment. What is a woman? And without taking a breath, she gave a brilliant 2-3 minute answer to that question, which, if I summarize, is this: a woman is somebody whose body is tailored towards
Well, here in Massachusetts, you know, we have this problem with 20 and 30-year-olds just not getting married. Mm-hmm. And so we recently had a marriage event, but on there was a big banner and the logo was "Be a rebel, get married, stay married, be fruitful and multiply." But we're in this place where it's actually rebellious to do those things. And you would think that the church would be addressing that, seeing this problem in society, but the church is silent. And I think it's due to what you said, they're not teaching the whole counsel of God that they used to.
That's right.
They're doing TED Talks.
The total fertility rate, so essentially the average number of children per woman per lifetime in Massachusetts, if you look at the state breakdown in the US, it's one of the lowest in the country. I think it's below 1.4 right now. So obviously replacement level is 2.1-ish. 1.3 something, which is where we're at. Massachusetts is lower than most of Western Europe. We're almost in sort of, South Korean, Japanese territory. It's lower than communist China, where they had a one-child policy until not that long ago. And yet we're the wealthiest and best educated in the world right here. So we've somehow lost the will or the desire to even create another generation. So that should be a red flag, regardless of your background, ideology, or faith, just at a fundamental biological level.
Yes, I think that, again, the issue here, of course, is, again, it's complicated. There's no single cause for it. But one of the problems, I think, is that we project an image of what it means to be a fulfilled human being, whereby children are important, providing they feed into my sense of well-being and my sense of personal fulfillment. I think that's one aspect of it. I think the loss of any sense, the idea that human beings are primarily individuals, that we are not embodied creatures with dependencies and obligations upon others is another thing. I think we need to practically model in our communities what great marriages look like. I think one of the things, we worry about is reproduction level. That's certainly significant. But I also think we're looking at what is going to be a catastrophic pandemic of loneliness. Mm-hmm. One of the great things about being married is, as the Book of Common Prayer says, about companionship. And it's about not growing old alone. That's not to say some couples, people get tragically widowed and there are things that happen, but the idea of spending some significant portion of one's old age not being lonely, that's a beautiful thing. How do you communicate that? Well, one of the ways to communicate that, I think, is by modeling what great marriages look like in your community. It's great to be in a church where there are old married couples pointing to younger people to the fact that, yes, you too can grow old with somebody. I make the comment to the students repeatedly in class, why is it that, Cosmopolitan will never interview an 80-year-old swinger? Why will they never interview an 80-year-old swinger? Because if they're still alive as 80-year-old swingers, they're pathetic, broken, and lonely people. They are not an advertisement for the lifestyle at all. Think on that. Think about what that means.
Right. Well, I think you're absolutely right about it being modeled. I mean, the reason why I came to the Mass Family Institute is because of the family I was blessed to grow up with, which was warm and loving. And, it's just been a goal of mine to recreate that for my own children and wife. And hopefully I've done a good job of that. But having that model just really, sets a path. And yet so many people today, increasing numbers, don't have that model for them at home, may be living in communities where they don't even know anybody else, any other children, where that's modeled. But I think that's precisely where the church should be bold in its declaration of what God's design for marriage and family are, but also living it out and hopefully modeling it to those who haven't seen it elsewhere.
I heard a pastor say once that, I asked them why they weren't teaching on marriage more, the importance of it. And they said they didn't want to offend the single people in the church. So, and that brings to your point about feelings really ruling our teachings in the church.
And I was a pastor myself for 6 years, and I think the single question has to be addressed sensitively, because a lot of single people want to be married. Particularly a lot of young women who are in the church, there just aren't the young men who, there aren't enough of them, or there aren't enough who are actually worth marrying. That's another question we could address. But it has to be handled sensitively. We don't want to create the picture that single people are somehow second class or can never be fulfilled, because that's playing into the culture as well. But on the other hand, we do need to stress, I think, the importance of marriage and the beauty of marriage. And it's also where I think hospitality is important. My view of the eldership, the description of the eldership that Paul gives in the New Testament is, there's nothing that an elder, with possible exception of ability to teach, there's nothing that an elder doesn't represent that all Christians shouldn't aspire to. Not being drunk all the time, organizing his household well, not being prone to violent anger. These are all, I would say, normal things that all Christians should aspire to. They're to be exemplified by the elders, I think, because the elders sort of set the tone and provide those models for the Christians in church to look to. And one of the characteristics of an elder, of course, is hospitality. And I think hospitality is critical, because that's where you can bring the lonely people, the single people, etc., into your house. You can model what marriage means to them. You can be a family for them if they have no family. There are all kinds of things, I think, that the church can do if it takes the practicalities of hospitality seriously.
Yeah, well, that's an important call. Another challenge that I want to just touch on with the church is sort of the seemingly inability to address issues of sexual orientation well from the pulpit, oftentimes, even just in the choice of language that's used. You often hear pastors, I think many of them well-intentioned, use terms like gay Christian or LGBT Christian, the sort of mixing of a God-driven identity with one that's driven simply by sexual desire, which I think goes to kind of one of the theses of your book, that this understanding of the self, sort of the Freudian hypersexualization, elevates sexual desire to the same level of core identity as Christian, which to me that's a bad idea. But we hear that terminology used. And so I had that in mind when I read on page 141 a quote from you where you say, the idea of sexual orientation really has no content. It is simply defined by subjective desire. Can you kind of unpack that for us, and how does that inform what terminology we should be using?
Yeah, I think when you think about identifying yourself by your sexual desire, it's just an intriguing thing to me. Why would we do that? We know that sexual desire is powerful. Again, why does the Iliad make sense to us when we read it today, nearly 3,000 years after it was written? Because it's about one man's sexual desire leading to all kinds of disastrous relationships and catastrophes. I say to the students at Grove, it's the same plot of every American soap opera every lunchtime, just with magnificent heroes rather than rather mediocre people. So we know that sexual desire is very powerful, but to identify ourselves by that is very, very peculiar. And I think it plays into a couple of things. One, conceptually, it's really the legacy of somebody like Sigmund Freud, where Freud develops this taxonomy of what does it mean to grow up from infancy to adulthood. Well, you can gauge it by the nature and direction of sexual desire. So sex, the sexual desire question, becomes the most important thing about any human being at any given stage in their development. But then when you think about it, it's rather odd, because sex is really something we do. I use the example of ancient Greece, I think, in the book. So I say, in ancient Greece, there was a lot of homosexual activity, but nobody identified themselves as gay. Sex was something they did. So to move to a position where an action, a desire that may or may not lead to an action, becomes an anchor of our identity is, I think, an arbitrary and odd thing to do. I had this strange conversation with a young man within the last 12 months. He was about 12 years old. Came up to me after a lecture I'd given, and he said to me, "I used to be bisexual, but now I'm straight because bisexuality wasn't working for me." And as the conversation proceeded, it became very clear to me that this young man had had no actual sexual experience whatsoever. He was simply talking about a state of mind. But if you're just talking about a state of mind that has no connection to how you've related or connected to anybody in the real world, then you're just talking about a subjective state that I think has no real weight to it whatsoever.
Hmm.
And this is why I think we need to be very careful about calling ourselves straight. Because when you describe yourself as a heterosexual or straight, in some ways I think you can be saying something legitimate, but on another level, you're conceding the ground that sexual desire is identity. And I think we need to be very careful that we don't, with the best of intentions, concede ground that will then become very, very problematic and complicated.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I wish that Christian pastors and leaders would stop using that terminology. It's very convenient, but I think those words are harmful to the overall understanding. It feeds into I think what you call the social imaginary. Yeah. That yes, our core desires do define who we are. Yeah. But not a healthy place to be.
Just to make a broader comment as well, I think this is one of the problems we have as Christians, because the Bible, of course, deals with sex as behavior. In some ways, when we're raising the question of sexual desire and sexual identity, we're demanding that the Bible answer a question that the Bible does not directly answer, because the Bible does not operate with those concepts. That's not to say that the Bible cannot give us an answer, right. But it isn't quite as straightforward as dealing with stealing or something like that. There's hard work that has to be done between the biblical text and the way we apply that from the pulpit to these kind of issues.
Right. Well, and if lust in our hearts is adultery, for all intents and purposes, for spiritual purposes, because those lustful thoughts, pursuing a desire, even if it's just in the mind, is a sinful act. So I think even to identify with a desire is a pursuit of that desire. In a way. So I think just very dangerous ground for us to be on, but instead it goes back to one of your statements. I had it written down here, but you said we're no longer able to separate, the love the sin or hate the sin, which I think is the correct approach.
Yeah.
I know even that, the courts have kind of thrown that out in the sense that they refuse to see a distinguishing between someone's orientation, right, which is what we call their desires, and the act. If it's discrimination either way. If you say no, we're only going to prevent, we're not going to rent our bed and breakfast to two men who are going to engage in this behavior. They would say you can't do that because it's really their orientation that you're discriminating against, and that's not permitted.
Homosexuality is effectively a protected identity.
It is, yeah.
Whereas traditional laws against homosexuality were against homosexual acts. We've now shifted to a position, again, partly because of that Freudian conceptual move, whereby homosexuals are a protected category in the same way that African Americans or women, et cetera, would be protected by Title IX legislation, for example.
Yeah, he said it was never about tolerance. He said it was always about, demanding that they be affirmed.
Yeah, it's about recognition. If you tolerate somebody, you say, well, I'm not going to send you to prison for being such and such or doing such and such, but I'm not going to fully acknowledge you as the way you want to be acknowledged yourself. And so tolerance is only ever going to be a halfway house in this kind of movement.
And that's where we get into the free speech issues, because as you say on page 157, the use of a word deemed hurtful or denigrating in the world of psychological identity is an assault upon the person, as real as in its own way as a blow from a fist. So this idea that speech becomes violence. So to not affirm, to misgender or dead name someone, as the terminology is in the transgender arena, that becomes violence. And we were talking before you joined that the arguments of these activists pushing, particularly transgenderism amongst the youth, is if you don't affirm or if you don't use the right pronouns, that person is very likely to harm themselves, to kill themselves. And so they really have make this connection between words and affirmation, or lack of affirmation, and violence.
Yeah. And on one level, as with so much of this stuff, that does touch on something of the truth. I think back to my school days. I went to an all-boys school. I joke, my school was a sort of arena of controlled, modest violence of boys against boys all the time. You get into scraps and fights. You play rugby. I've got a scar above my one eye where I was kicked in the head playing rugby once. But I don't remember much of that at all. What I do remember are hurtful comments that were made. So we are all aware that words can be very cutting and very hurtful. And this sort of the identity politics latches onto that truth, but then, of course, dramatically amplifies it and extends the scope of it, so that not the sort of the violently cruel insult, but even the mild non-affirmation becomes a sort of brutal attack on my person. So this is why freedom of speech, I think, is coming under and will continue to be under huge pressure for some time to come.
We had sort of many examples of that here locally, but there have been several instances where people have called my office and they have been put in a position at work, typically at a school, but other work environments as well, where they're being compelled to use the preferred pronouns of a coworker or a student, and they're very much at risk of losing their job, but they feel a conviction that this is sort of like that pinch of incense to Caesar from the early church, that this would be denying their God who made us, male and female, in his image. To use the biologically false pronouns would be speaking a lie and denying God's truth. And I wonder, my sense is that the church is going to have to get substantially on the same page with what are those new hills that we're going to die on, that we haven't thought about, that's not a verse for it, but we have to have some sort of unity or critical mass so we can reinforce each other and encourage each other. Otherwise, I just see us this rapid assimilation as the edges just kind of get peeled away.
Well, you can't stand on the Bible. Where we're going, the Bibles are going to be banned because you can't stand on biblical truth. If laws are created to punish us for standing on biblical truth, we're all in trouble.
Right. So persecution, I think, it is already here in some senses. And the concern now is, okay, well, how do we fight against assimilation and apostasy? What are those hills? What's the new pinch of incense to Caesar in the realm of the sexual revolution?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think this is an area where the church needs to do a lot more thinking. I mean, if you take the specific transgender issue there, I've thought about this, and I think, if somebody changes their name, if John becomes Joanna, that's not a big deal. I happen to have a granddaughter with a male middle name because it was the family tradition that the firstborn has the middle name James. Girl or boy has the name James. I guess it's going back to a previous generation. Somebody wants to change their name from John to Joanna. A name is just a name. That's not a big deal. Pronouns, though, have a specific usage and reference. And I think when you start using somebody's preferred pronouns, you start to confirm them in a lie they're telling about themselves. Now, I'll qualify this slightly. Say, if you're standing on the window ledge on the 34th floor of a skyscraper, and you say to me, unless you use my pronouns, I'm not going to come in, I may just use your pronouns at that point to get you inside so I can talk to you and get you some out. But those are not the situations we're talking about here. We're talking about routine work situations. I think there's going to be some very interesting lawsuits coming from these things, because I think we're going to have to raise the question of whether it is reasonable for employers to make these demands on their employees. But I don't think there's any way of Christians getting around this either. I think to use the preferred pronouns is to affirm something that isn't true. And you may do that for the best of possible intentions, or you may do it out of cowardice. But either way, I think you're doing the wrong thing. And somebody might say, well, I'll lose my job if I follow that advice. And you teach at Grove City College, nobody's threatening your job. And I say, well, it's easy I accept it's easy for me to say this. And maybe it's trite for me to say this. But because it's easy and trite for me to say it doesn't mean it isn't true. And you've got to remember, what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world but lose his soul? Think about Paul in 2 Corinthians when he's talking about all the persecution he's suffering there. And he refers to it as a light momentary affliction compared to the eternal weight of glory that is to come. I think Christians have got to reorient themselves to the holiness of God and the greatness of eternity in order to start putting this world in some kind of perspective.
I mean, I think you bring up a good point on page 157 too, where you just say Goliath mocked David, Cicero insulted Catiline, but with the rise of the psychologized self, words have taken on a new cultural power, as witnessed by the fierce debates. I mean, where we are, the psychologized self is really ruling. I mean, we have churches that are bringing in counselors to set up offices within their churches. So instead of biblical counseling, they're doing psychological counseling. And it says, we're no longer accountable to God, but to our therapist. And it's just a really interesting place where the church is going. The world has been there, but now to see the church dabbling in this stuff is a really disturbing thing in our culture.
Yes, and I think some of it comes down to a failure to teach a proper anthropology. I mean, for many years, the church, the basic ethics of the world around and the ethics of the church sort of tracked along in the same direction, maybe for different reasons, but they tracked in the same direction, which meant that the church did not have to think long and hard about how it was grounding its ethics in a biblical anthropology. I think those days have disappeared so quickly. We've been wrong-footed by this. And we've really found ourselves to be defenseless against the inroads of the therapeutic culture.
Well, and I think pastors are scared about lawsuits that come against them if they give the wrong advice, biblical advice that doesn't line up with the culture or our state laws.
Yes, I mean, there are all kinds of interesting developments in the law taking place, and some of them, yes, are affecting pastors. And again, I think we're going to get a slew of First Amendment lawsuits relative to this kind of stuff in the coming years.
And along those lines, Dr. Trueman, we have an audience question. We've got people participating online in this webinar, so I want to take some of those questions. And this is, what is your view of the role of the courts and how much of a place they should have in our strategy, I guess, as a church, as Christians, and our strategy for cultural preservation, which, as you know, is similar to Rod Dreher, the author of Live Not by Lies, a Benedict option. He talks about, look, we have to stay politically involved. We're not saying run away from politics, at least in order to preserve religious freedom. A lot of that's going to be through the courts. I'm an attorney myself, so I very much have an opinion on that. But what do you think about the role of the courts in our cultural preservation of Christians?
Well, I think we need to understand that the courts can only have a limited impact. I've said to the students, the problem we face in America, it's not a case of just getting the right Supreme Court justice appointed. That won't solve it. Having said that, courts are very important. What do courts do? Well, I think the courts are there to maintain laws that protect the weak and the innocent. And we as citizens, we as members of the civic sphere, I think we have a duty and obligation to use the tools we have in order to make sure that we live in a society where the weak and the innocent are protected. When I got some libertarian students who will say, the state should stay out of marriage. The answer to marriage is the state should stay out of marriage. I said, well, that's nonsense, because we only ever really had marriage laws to protect children. We've lost sight of that with this idea that, hey, marriage is all about my partner making me feel good and I can get out of it with no fault divorce if that ceases to be the case. We had a state interest in marriage because that was protecting the weakest and most innocent members of society. So I am a big believer in using the civic rights and the civic liberties we do have in order to protect the weak and the innocent, in order to protect religious freedom. I see nothing remotely ambiguous or complicated about that whatsoever. Would I be happy to sign an amicus brief on some issue if I thought it was going to help? Absolutely. So I think we should.
I may take you up on that.
Please do. I think groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Beckwith Fund, they do great work. I think it's worth watching these groups. It's worth giving to them as and when we can. And it's certainly worth using them as and when we find ourselves in problems.
Massachusetts is an interesting place because the weak and the marginalized are the Christians right now. We just have 2 close conservative teenage boys who committed suicide in the past 3 years because they were bullied in their liberal schools. So that term, weak and marginalized, is not what you think it means where we live.
Yeah, I mean, can I just say, I think we live in an era which is monstrous in its treatment of children. I was sent a picture today of a young transgender girl who'd had her body mutilated in order to produce a fake penis, which is never going to be a real penis, and yet her body's been mutilated. And this is being pushed by insurance companies, by doctors, and by politicians. Now, on the trans issue, I think it will be relatively short-lived. Maybe it won't die in my lifetime, but it's going to come crashing down with lawsuits when these young kids who should have been protected by adults behaving like adults were actually used as part of some crazy anthropological experiment. What saddens me is that the men and women pushing this stuff, frankly, won't be going to prison. I'm glad to think they'll be sued, but I think this is institutionalized criminal child abuse. That's the hallmark of our era at this point in time. And it is distressing and disgusting. And to go back to the earlier question about the courts, yes, let us use the courts to try to beat these people, because the youngest and the most vulnerable and the most confused in our society are being destroyed by the very people who should protect them.
I think it's absolutely right. And unfortunately, I think you're also probably correct that no one's going to go to jail. At least I'd be surprised. They certainly should, but there just seems to be a lack of accountability in general. It'll be like so many other things we've seen recently where you're getting one, dominant narrative that's pushed by all, the major outlets in academia. And then when that becomes unsustainable, there'll be a sort of brief admission that they were wrong and they'll be on to something else, and there'll be no accountability. Although I do hope with the lawsuits, that may bring some accountability. We have a number of pediatric gender clinics in Massachusetts Boston Children's Hospital received some notoriety on that fairly recently with just videos, I think posted to Libs of TikTok, if you're familiar with them, videos taken right off of Boston Children's Hospital pediatric gender clinic's website. So again, this isn't anything that's not being done out there in the open, talking about surgeries for young children and putting children up. So the breast surgery for children 15 and older, and then genital surgeries. Supposedly kids have to be at least 18, but hormones, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones for teenagers. I've worked with parents whose 12, 13-year-old kids are being put on these drugs. It is monstrous. And so when I was reading your book and reading about the things, particularly that Freud and was it William Reich were writing about children being sexual beings, it reminds me of what I was taught in law school in some of my classes, that children have sexual needs. So we need to ensure that they are able to give consent. That's why we have the ages of consent. It's really just a legal placeholder for the ability to give consent. But I guess one of my questions is, how did these guys, Freud and Reich, when you look at their personal lives and you look at what they're writing, they're pretty depraved. And people use the term pedophiles and groomers now to talk about what's going on in the public schools, just in the books that are being put out there and what's being taught. How is what these guys wrote, which is very similar, it's maybe at a little more sophisticated level, but how was that acceptable 100 years ago, when we'd like to think we weren't as crazy as we are now?
Yeah, well, I think I'd make a distinction between Freud and Reich. What's interesting about Freud is he's actually a relatively conservative guy in many ways. He thinks that it's very important that children are brought up to control their sexual desires, because if they're not, they're going to be unacceptable as adults. They're going to be rapists, etc., etc. So Freud, oddly enough, we tend to think sexual repression is a bad thing. or we don't think Freud thought that, but it's not entirely the case, that he actually thought that a careful and disciplined sexual education for children was important, because children have to learn that they can't simply act on their appetites, because that will have a very, very detrimental effect on society. In his work, Civilization is Discontents, he sort of makes the point that that means that there'll always be dissatisfied with the world, but that's a problem. We have to curb our desires in order to live as a civilization, in order to have the best chance of survival as a society. Reich is very different. I think Reich is much more of your clear, strange, perverse kind of guy. And what's interesting about Reich is he's very clear that he believes that sexual relations between children should be encouraged. What's odd is that there's this passage in the Sexual Revolution where he's gone on and on about how any objections to this are bourgeois morality, oppressive, etc., etc. Then he raises the question of, what about an adult having sexual relations with a very young child? And he makes a sort of comment. He says, well, clearly that's unacceptable. But he can offer no justification as to why. He just passes over it. Yeah. And in one of the books, I think it was in the bigger book, I pick up on this, and I said, but the big question is why? Why is that particular taboo unassailable? Why can't that be historically relativized like the others? So I think Reich is not willing to go where his own thinking takes him. There is a limit, but it's a purely arbitrary limit. It's not consistent with anything else that he says. What's also interesting is in my friend Abigail Favali's book, The Genesis of Gender, which I recommend to your listeners. It's published by Ignatius Press. Excellent book. She'd be a wonderful guest on a program like this. She digs up a letter to the French press calling for the legitimation of sex between adults and minors, that's signed by many of the great and good of the French left, Jean-Paul Sartre, etc., etc. And it's hard not to believe that the philosophies of these people was not in some way connected to their own sexual ambitions or desires, if not for themselves personally, then ambitions for society as a whole. So there is a deep and perverse sexuality that underlies a lot of the thinking that has percolated into the social imaginary. We now know, for example, that Michel Foucault went to North Africa to rape little boys on gravestones. Hasn't damaged his authority as perhaps the most quoted thinker in the humanities in higher education. But it certainly, I think, goes deep to the heart of the kind of person he was, and should surely raise questions about the legitimacy of some of the things he was arguing.
Well, as I was reading this, I kept having to make a mental note to go research. I couldn't believe Rousseau, he wrote a book on parenting and gave up every single one of his 5 babies to an orphanage. Yeah. And just, it's amazing the life that these people actually lived.
Yeah, and Rousseau, he has to address it in his Confessions, because Voltaire, who's a huge rival, sort of leaks this to the public as a way of trying to show them how awful. I mean, Voltaire was not a great guy, but Rousseau was really reprehensible. And so Rousseau has to address it in his Confessions, but it's a blink and you'll miss it moment. He says, oh, by the way, I had 5 children, sent them all to orphanages because I thought the orphanage would be a better parent than I could ever be. But when you sit back and think about, one, that's sentencing all 5 of those kids to death. You didn't go to an orphanage and survive in the 18th century.
It says he never saw them again.
No, he didn't care for them. And one assumes they died in infancy. The second thing is it's entirely consistent with his philosophy. His philosophy can be summed up in that statement in the Social Contract. Man is born free and everywhere is in chains. Well, if man is born free, then every relationship he has is a contractual one. To be contracted on the basis of, does this person, bringing this person into my life, enhance my life and my freedom, or work to the detriment of my life and freedom? Every one of his children, I think he saw them as a link in that chain that restricted his freedom, and therefore they had to be broken off.
But I think you made a good point, because all of these people, they did have good ideas, but then their toxic ideas rode in on those good ideas. And you did a great job of putting that thread, showing the thread that ran through just right up until today, how we got here.
Yeah, I think it's the case with so many bad philosophies. At the heart of them, there's a kernel of truth, or there's an insight. You know, critical race theory, for example. I don't have much time for critical race theory, but does racism exist? Yes. Does it sometimes manifest itself in systems? Well, slavery, clearly a racist system. But that doesn't allow you then to build a comprehensive lens or philosophy for understanding the whole of life based on that. Think about Michel Foucault's philosophy, where everything comes down to relationships of power. Are relationships manipulative? Yes. As a Christian, I would say, I never act out of pure motives. Sure, when I give money to charity, I want to do something kind, but maybe I'm also making myself feel pretty good at the same time. All of these sort of heretical thinkers latch onto something that's true, that gives their thought a ring of truth and plausibility, which I think helps explain why they gain such traction, or one of the factors why they gain such traction in wider society.
Well, I kind of had a question about that critical theory. I saw you in an interview recently with Albert Mohler, and you said that you were doing some research on critical theory, and you said that critical theory is like a mathematical equation, and it's set and it's not going to change. There was yesterday, Pennsylvania District Court says that they're injecting feelings into the new math curriculum. This has been in Massachusetts probably for about 5 years, where the kids are taught that math is a mindset and their emotional feelings go into it.
I certainly hated it as a kid. I had strong feelings about math, but I don't think
well, there was a person, a parent objected and said, this is just critical race theory packaged into the math curriculum. In Massachusetts, it's packaged into all across the board. Every curriculum has critical race theory underneath. But I just wanted you said you were going to create curriculums for maybe seminary students or youth pastors to help them deal with critical theory. How would you communicate that to a parent who has to unpack this to her 5th grade student? Is there language for that?
Yeah, well, what I'm doing, I'm actually writing a book on early critical theory, the critical theory of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where I think the foundation is laid, and all other later theories, gender theory, race theory, are sort of variations on, I think you said, the sort of mathematical equation, the basic pattern. I do think, though, the early critical theory is far more sophisticated than the later stuff. We deal with sort of cheap shopfront stuff today. The earlier guys were much more sophisticated. I think it's hard to communicate this to parents because there's so much specious plausibility about some of the claims that are made. And I think the key is to realize that what critical theory is doing, what critical race theory is doing, is it's appealing to, I would say, good instincts in people. Who wants to be a racist? Who wants to be involved in mistreating somebody or treating somebody as less than human because of the color of their skin or their ethnic origin? No decent person wants to do that. So I think there's an emotional pull that critical race theory has there. The key is that critical race theory then presents itself as the only show in town. The only way of addressing it is if you address it in this way. Well, one of the things I would say that Christian parents could do, just as a very simple exercise to get to the heart of what's wrong, ask, where does forgiveness feature in this? Is there any forgiveness in critical race theory? Is there any grace in critical race theory? Is there any room for gratitude in critical race theory? All of these things that I think are central components of Christianity, but also central components of what it means to be a civilized human being and to have an experience of civilization that is marked by civility. They need to ask themselves, where does this feature in this stuff? And the answer, of course, is it doesn't. It doesn't feature in these things. And that, I think, shows you the very deep flaw that's at the heart of it.
Well,
the kids are coming home doing math problems and they're saying, 2 + 2 = 5. And the parent will say, no, you have to come up with the correct answer. And they're taught that, no, the teacher is grading them on their mindset, their process, how they're thinking about the problem. And so,
what can I say? The world is being taken over by idiots.
I don't know.
This is idiotic. Quite frankly, I don't want to drive over a bridge designed and built by somebody who thinks that 2 + 2 = 4 is an act of white supremacy.
Yes.
You can drive over a bridge designed and built by somebody like that if you wish. Monkey around with literary texts all you want. Muck around with literary texts. But bottom line is, certain things, brain surgeons, bridge architects, people who build buildings, people who design airplanes, they have to conform to the laws that are there. Reality is not ultimately merely a social linguistic construct. And if we're going to allow lunatics to teach our children mathematics, well, I'm just going to have to stop driving over bridges.
I think, like you mentioned about the transgender movement, particularly with the surgeries, this is just unsustainable. So at some point, the wheels are going to have to come off. And I want to be respectful of your time, Doctor. We've got one more question from the audience, and I think it could be a positive one. It reaches back to one of the first things you said, where we need to have the long view to do the things now that we may not see the results of, but that there is hope. And the question is this: are you encouraged by any of the positive political developments happening in more conservative states, such as restrictions on abortion or bans for these gender treatments for minors? I think probably what they have in mind, in part at least, is in Florida, where they've got a governor there who is doing things that I wouldn't even think to ask if we had a conservative governor up here. He's sort of doing them on his own. So to me, that's been pretty encouraging, at least on a national level. What are your thoughts on that strategy?
Yeah, I'm encouraged on a number of fronts. I'm actually encouraged on the way that the trans issue is moving in Europe. Europe's becoming more, just a little bit, but the direction that's moving on the trans issue, I think, is good in Europe. America is too gung-ho on it at the moment. We've got a lot of work to do in America to start slowing this thing down and reversing the process. Very encouraged on the legislative front relative to abortion. Very encouraged on what seems to be an increasing buy-in of parents into school boards and things, and not just in trenchant conservative states. It's interesting what's happened in Virginia more recent, in the last year or so. So very encouraged that people are finally waking up some of this stuff. I'm a little concerned that I think we need to be careful that we don't end up seeing the pendulum swinging so far the other way that some of the basic freedoms get truncated by the right, so to speak. I think we need to be very careful that what's being done is not simply reaction, but actually has a positive vision of the way forward. And I also think that, I gave a talk at the pro-life breakfast in Pennsylvania on Saturday, and I made a comment. I drew from Oliver O'Donovan. Oliver O'Donovan, the British ethicist, makes an interesting comment in an essay he wrote on abortion. He says one of the things that wrong-footed him on the abortion debate was that what he as an ethicist thought was the weakest argument the opposition had turned out to be the argument that won it for them. And the weakest argument, he said, is the argument that the baby in the womb is just part of the woman's body. He said, as an ethicist, that's a pathetically weak argument. And yet that's the one that won. And that got me intrigued. Why did that argument win? And I think the answer is because it grabbed the imagination. It didn't work as an ethical argument, but it chimed with the imagination. And I think what pro-life groups have to do, and what those advocates for traditional sexuality have to do, is we've got to win the battle for the public imagination. We can pass laws, but go back to Rousseau says laws don't really have any power behind them if they don't also connect to the way people imagine the world to be. The law is always going to be unstable and challenged in those situations. I think we need to think creatively. Think about how was some of the tide turned on the abortion issue? It wasn't arguments, it was sonograms. When
Mhm.
people could see the baby in the womb and wow, it looks like a tiny person. The imagination is uh, set on fire in a way that 1,000 compelling arguments from an ethicist will never do. So
Right.
yes, I'm encouraged by legislative change, but I think we need to think like the critical theory guys. We need to think about cultural change here. How do we transform the cultural imagination? I think we can do that. I think we can do it on the trans issue by making sure that there are lots and lots of detransitioner testimonies out there, by making
Right.
sure that people see the true horror of what's going on. We can win this stuff, but we have to do it with more than just arguments and legislation.
Well, I agree, and yeah, part of what we need to do is, in a way, storytelling. And at MFI, we try to help others tell their stories. And when you talk about sonograms and ultrasounds being, more powerful than all these other logical and ethical arguments, that's totally true. And the abortionists know it, which is why in Massachusetts, their strategy right now, they've got a bill pending. They want to spend $1 million doing a PR program trying to smear pregnancy resource centers, and pass laws to sort of silence them, because they know how powerful that picture is, that image. So we're working hard to defend them as well. Well, I thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. I know we'll be hanging on to this book as a reference, among other things, to kind of go back and just, who said what and where did that take us. We're looking forward to your next book. So please, I'm sure you'll let us know when that comes out. So thank you again for joining us, Dr. Trueman.
Thanks very much for having me.
And for everyone else watching at home, thank you for being a part of this tonight. We will have this up on YouTube shortly, in a day or so, and you can send it out to friends and relatives who weren't able to join us live. You can always go to our website at mafamily.org and look at the past 2 years' book clubs. Those should still be up there on our YouTube channel. If you have any comments or questions from tonight or suggestions for a book for next year, please feel free to send those to us at info@mafamily.org, info@mafamily.org. And again, you can always find out what we're up to here, defending families and faith and freedom in the Commonwealth, at mafamily.org. Have a great night.